there.
I'm Ken Moss, progressive educator. Talk a little bit about what I've bumped into in hopes that it would be of some use to other persons in the field. We used to have an expression that we every once in a while would use at the Maslatoff School of Futuristic Education. Milt Seiler brought to our attention. He'd like to say, we don't do Freudian therapy here. So when John asked me to address the question of what were my earliest influences, I'm not doing this in the spirit of my own personal traumas, but rather most of us find early on in our life that there is something that we get stuck. And in some sense, one of the first early influences is the particular sticking points that we run into in our own lives. And recognizing that if we can find some people or some circumstances which can help us get past that, that would be a good thing. Well, I had some in my own life. And I went early to a therapist with a Viennese accent yet. I believe I was 6. I liked her very much. Her name was Dr. Moore. And she was something. And just to kind of give you an idea of what I remember, she had this exercise which she gave me, and which we did in her office in the city. She asked this 6-year-old to light a match and to look into the flame and to put anyone that I was particularly into the flame. And I put teachers in there. I put would-be friends in there. I put the guy who told me I was swinging on his monkey bar in there. He had carved his initials in the piece. Anyway, I put a lot of people in there, and each, at the end of each session, say, okay, light another match, Ken. See who you want to put in there. It took me 2 months before I finally got my father in the match. So that happened early. The other thing that happened early was that my father and my parents generally had the most progressive values. They saw things from a distinctly leftist perspective. And that included some things that are not widely discussed today, like my father said, work is ennobling. Well, I'm not saying Marx would have put it exactly like that, but I always believed it. I always believed it was possible to do some serious work and feel good about the work itself. And that always drove me. And teaching was one of those things that later on I could feel good about the work itself. I had opportunities to make money. Wasn't in this field. And after I say it, I was good at mathematics, and with that would have come money. I was good at chemistry, and with that would have come money. But it wasn't the values of my family at that time. And so that was certainly an influence. The other piece was a little strange. I liked to get out of the family and out of the house. And beginning at age 7, I began to go off yearly to residential summer camps. And I loved them. Outside of Christmas Eve, no day was so wonderful for me each year than when I left to go out to summer camps scattered throughout the Berkshires, and some of them extremely progressive, one where the fascists had been beaten off by baseball bats. The story was legion in the area. One which was just beautiful. I remember having to interview for permission to go to the camp, and it took like 4 years before I was admitted. They had limited numbers of persons that they took, different, psychology. I remember the owner of the camp, the first thing he wanted to do was to bring me to the rifle range to shoot targets. And here I was with a paraplegic father from the Second World War. And he just figured that might be something he'd have trouble facing. That might be his sticking point. But you see, I had come from the experience with the flame. I had no trouble shooting targets. But that idea of the idyllic community was really important. And every once in a while, it would reoccur of its own volition. In 11th grade, there was a singing group, a folk music singing group with a distinctly progressive background. 6 or 7 of us would go from history class to history class, singing Union songs and civil rights songs. And Nancy Kershaw was kind of the leader. Boy, what a voice. This is the woman who married Rubens, SDS. You get the idea. And she would sing the Deportees. Goodbye to you, Juan. Goodbye, Rosalita. It was hard not to cry. It was hard not to connect. History courses after history courses. Special moment. And then, of course, there was theater groups. I loved the theater. My first date was Raisin in the Sun on Broadway. Saw some good stuff. Took it with me. The cast would form this idyllic group. Hard to describe exactly. I didn't have church in my life. We were atheists and proud of it at that time. And this gave an opportunity for that kind of connection that other people find elsewhere. So you can imagine that when Maslow Toffler came along, this was yet again building on that experience. And later in life, it was the Gardens for Nutrition of New Paltz. And 3 years in the presidency, and 3 years before that, redoing the entire gardens, the oldest community gardens in the state of New York. So I'm told, professor at Albany, for source. So that was important. I would say those were the most fundamental influences. I took no education courses at all as an undergrad. But at Hofstra, I did run into Calitri. So John Sherin is familiar here, of course. And Calitri offered an idea that I had not before really contacted me. And that was his notion of affective education. The notion that it was not mental cerebrum alone that one needs to pay attention to, but feelings, since feeling is first, etc. And that got me to thinking. I would later take the idea and recognize that even that was too narrow, and we could go Jungian if we wanted and extend it, and talk about intuition over here and maybe artistry over there and physical doing. One of the bizarre, and I do mean bizarre, aspects of American education system is that we have almost nothing physical. Could you imagine running an educational system where we have brick buildings and going out into the world to discover about the world is virtually not done or made so difficult it is rarely done. Bizarre. Maybe shop, industrial arts, gym class. But going off to see cartoonists or going off to explore in ways that we had never seen before, wood shops and who knows what else. I love our modern discussion of students not knowing what job they're going to take. They don't know because they've been isolated in the school. I was so isolated, I figured the only thing I knew anything about was school. So maybe that made the decision for me. I knew I didn't want to work for IBM or DuPont, so there we are. So I began. I took a couple of years of master's courses where I considered Calittri's ideas, seemed to make sense to me, and I decided, okay, I was ready. I did a little work directing drama clubs after school at other places, and then I chose the worst community that I could find in Brentwood. I considered it the worst because it was not widely respected at the time, but I liked it because it was diverse. I went for an interview with the assistant principal, South Junior High in Brentwood, and it wasn't a long interview. I asked him two questions. I asked him if he thought that the housing patterns in Brentwood would remain fundamentally the same for a decade or so, with the implication of the diversity of the population, in terms of race, in terms of religion, in terms of ethnicity. I wanted that diverse population. I did not want to, work from the slums to do. And he assured me, yes, that was not a problem. And the other question I asked was, and do you think you could arrange for me to have the worst class in the school for 2 periods a day? He didn't answer directly. He just came back with a contract. No callbacks necessary. And so I began, 8th grade. And a week into it, I realized that nothing in my educational preparation had any use, had any relevance. I had to draw on something else. I had thought, well, I was really good at grammar. I was a mathematician, I was really good at grammar. And I could teach anybody grammar. How to put a kind of word in a peach basket, you call this here, this is a verb. All right, let's work on verbs, And I did. I was real good at it. I taught English grammar, and students would get, almost without exceptions, 90 on quiz after quiz after quiz. They would get 90s on these grammar tests. And I kept giving them, I kept going on to different parts of speech, and what's a subject of a sentence, and how you can use a phrase as a subject of a sentence. And I realized, in not too long time, that their writing was awful, stayed awful, and that what I was doing was absolutely to no purpose. I don't know why I'd gotten the idea that grammar had somehow related to English, but it wasn't so. Some years later, when I did graduate work at Berkeley, I looked on the ERIC index, and sure enough, there were 204 research projects that attempted to correlate grammar knowledge with writing ability. And in 200 of the 204, there were no correlation, no statistical correlation. And it was right. Well, at the time, I just asked the other English teachers, what's this? How can they do well on grammar tests and they can't write? And they said, well, we know that's true, but, so we do both. Okay. At that point, I began to look for other ways of approaching the matter. And what I came up with was, all right, we were following this curriculum. I think it was a Midwestern curriculum called the Euclid, as I remember it. And it basically told us what books we could choose from, what books we could use for the literature part. And I decided, okay, we would read a piece of literature, and then the students would be asked to do writing in the same style and the same basic piece of literature, which worked out okay. You know, we had a narrative poem, so they would try their hand at a narrative poem, and maybe it was free verse, or maybe it had a rhythm. And then we got to the Diary of Anne Frank. And the parallel to the Diary of Anne Frank was for them to write a diary. I guess later we'd call it a journal or a workbook, because I wanted to see how they were doing. So, one doesn't read somebody else's diary. But of course, who could resist? And in fact, I did read. And what it did was open the world of that consciousness, those with those ethnic differences from my own, a world different from my own, an age different from my own, put down on paper. And by God, the writing began to move, because now the student had something to express. They were telling me what their world was, what their thoughts were. And I would read it. And after a while, began to respond in the margins. Respond sometimes with wisdom, sometimes with questions, sometimes with a different perspective. I would get to things like, forever is a feeling, not a time. That was my favorite. Almost as an alert to the student who was so in love, nothing else mattered. And then some time later, it wouldn't work out, maybe. And they would go back through there. Forever is a feeling, not a time. And I liked what it did. So I began to play with that. But at the time, when I first introduced this idea, I ran into one of my major stumbles in my career in Brentwood. The very next day, there was a Newsday reporter outside the door of one of my English classes, asking students about the new sex ed class. I couldn't imagine where it came from. This was just upon the introduction. But what had happened was that the students were having trouble coming up with what to write in the workbook, what to write in the journal. So the class and I developed a number of projects. We wrote them all on the board, a number of questions that could be addressed in the student. And among the 40 that we came up with, one said, what sort of relationships have you had? And this class wanted to divide that, so they made a distinction between with other girls, with other boys, and with members of the opposite sex. What sort of relationships have you? The student had written, what sort of relations have I had with members of the opposite sex? Father had read the English assignment for the day. Father had called Newsday. Newsday had called the principal. The Newsday reporter was outside the door. This is my first year of teaching. The principal, to his credit, Michael Tabellis, to his credit, he said, well, Kent, what do you want to do? And I said, this is too early. Bury it. So I called my sources and he called his. And the article did not appear in Newsday. Made it easier to deal with. But the journal or the workbook became a critical part of my teaching, and later on was certainly used in the Massachusetts School, became a critical part there. And what I did was I developed 3 styles. Later on in my pre-doctorate paper, I wrote one called As Easy as 1, 2, 3. And that was also the title of a workshop that I gave when Brentwood hosted a humanistic conference in the major school. We had like 1,000 people come, and I was part of the organizing three from the Brentwood Teachers Association. And it was really quite a nice conference. I insisted that it be voluntary, and yet the parking lot was in fact filled with people. And I did this one for the first time, as easy as 1, 2, 3, and I was referring to ways of using the journal in a workbook in a humanities class. And the idea of the one was that the student, as in the original diary idea, would simply write for themselves, and it would be there for them to read. And if they allowed a teacher to read it, then they would. In the two, the idea is that it would be changed into a dialogue. There were pluses to it. The student would now know that somebody was reading and perhaps responding to their ideas. And thus the teacher could enter into the exchange. Now, of course, teachers always entered into the exchanges with students. Maybe the student asked for a little time after class if it were private, or maybe it took place within the context of a regular class. But here it was also responding in writing, and therefore encouraging writing. And the dialogue could open questions to be thought about. It didn't have to be spontaneously responded to. And I would take home all these books, 125 students, and bring them back so they could continue their work. It was really quite effective. And in the three, and here we certainly made use of it at the alternative school, the ideas were then addressed to the greater community. In other words, pieces of the workbook were read. And that worked particularly well in the classroom when I would offer an idea, or I would write a question, and we would have all these varied responses from maybe half the class, maybe the entire class would write something in response, or maybe even during the class I would ask for a response. And then who would like to read? And so we got a sense we could share these diverse views on a particular question or a particular subject, and thus larger than just the couple bond. Now it would be open to the community. And of course at Maslow, even to the greater community, one could read with a community meeting of over 100 persons and share it that way. So that became critical. I continued my work in theater, and that special opportunity. I found that the students at Brentwood at that time were particularly responsive to it, and I ended up directing, writing, participating with various musicians. In fact, 3/5 of the band Orleans participated in 2 of the musicals. And we would do these original musical shows. Beginning with I Heard It in the Boys' Room, the Family Album, Room for Two, college dorm roommates, and later at Maslow, Revolution, and at the 200th anniversary of, and The Stoned Age. I must confess, The Stoned Age was the first time that the audience at mid-break, at intermission, did not have a high-pitched, cheery kind of sound. It was time to change audience, and I let it go. The Maslow Toffler School experience was certainly a cornerstone, a special opportunity. And working with Milt Seiler and John Sherin, later Joseph Trousseau joined us, was a very special experience. And the students who came there offered a very special experience. Just the notion that we were no longer grading. You'll notice that grading never played a major role in what it was I was doing. And I gave grades because it was required, but it never sat well with me. Students should want the learning, should find it in themselves, what it is that they wanted to pursue. And I think we shared that as a fundamental idea among us at Marist, and the idea of one person, one vote made us really extraordinary. There were a lot of alternative schools in this country, and many did not give grades. But one person, one vote. You come to school, faculty, even though it's a Regents Day, because the community wants you there. I liked it. It touched on the early training of who I was. Anyway, so that was something difficult because we were always under attack for one thing or another. It was almost like the dark thoughts that anybody could have. And what are these people doing? They're not doing the same thing. If they're not doing the same thing, they could be doing anything. And it just went on and on and on. It wasn't until I went to California on a leave of absence, went off to Berkeley, that I realized that the same attacks that we were having in Brentwood was had by alternative schools all throughout the state of California. It was really, I did interviews from students and professors of 100 alternative schools. And if the union wasn't mad at them, the administration wasn't mad at them, the right wing of the community wasn't mad at them, church groups weren't mad, it just went on and on and on and on. For myself, though, I must confess, it was a special experience. But in my head, it was also that idyllic place. That place where after you were there, you came back home to the world that was before, to the community that was before. I suppose by the time I was done, I put a little Buddhist touch on it. That is to say, you go to the mountain to study, and then you come back down if you decide to, and rejoin the world to offer to the world what it is you think that you learned. And that's exactly what I did. While my sense was that John was upset when he decided Maslow was done, I was not. To me, it was long expected. And I returned to the room, only now my room would have rugs in it, and it would have curtains in it, it would have a sign, beware ye who enter here, and so forth and so on. And it would have workbooks, and it would have, but of course I'd now have to give grades. Stand at the hall occasionally. That's the way it is. I did give up my union work at that point. I stopped doing drama at that point, but I continued to work on the notion of preparation. One of the critical fallacies of Western education as we've been practicing it is that it's so important for teachers to have time to prepare and time to respond. Most Asian schools work it so that half of the teacher's workday is available for exactly that, for preparing the lesson, for remarking on student papers, doing that special encouragement. Half the day. I have been there. I was in Taiwan. I literally watched as they did this, and I went, of course. Well, we knew this at Maslow. I remember when John Sherin was telling me that despite what I may have thought, it was absolutely essential that students have large amounts of time when the faculty was not directly supervising their presence. He called it unstructured time. It was basically the college system. You have classes a certain number of days a week, maybe one, maybe two, maybe even three, but that's it. And then all the rest of the time is spent in individual work, including the work of the faculty and the meetings and so forth. this idea that faculty is supposed to teach classes with more and more classes and more students and more work is not in the best interest of improving education, and it never will be. Now, when we talk about doing 3 classes during the day and having the rest of a 6-hour day for other things that were helpful in the preparation, now we're talking. Will it cost money? Yeah. Guess what? It will cost money. Even with the most dedicated of us, none of us want to starve because we are carefully planning a lesson. Instead, it takes years and years to be able to pull out what we need in order to do it. And even then, it's shortchanging the students. We need to rethink. And I used to rethink from the previous year, but I got better at having this whole slew. I would prepare English elective courses. At one point, we decided, the administration of the English department decided we would develop 16 English elective courses to be taught at the traditional school. I did work on 3. I had, with Joe Trousseau's help, did one on, we called it source studies. I had a BOCES grant one summer that helped me develop this course, which integrated kind of a comparative mythology idea. And I worked on that one, developed it with detail, put the hyacinth bulb into the water at this date of the month, let it flower, tell the story of. I gave it out to the English department. BOCES distributed it throughout Suffolk County, and as far as I know, nobody used it. Day by day by day. I developed a course that later on would be called Great Books of Western Civilization, making use of some of that early Greek and Roman writing. And so source studies had a follow-up. I developed one which I called at the time Psychology Through Literature. And here again, I was working from that psychological perspective, only I was allowing the ideas in psychology, the ideas about the human condition, of the human soul, of the human psyche, to be expressed by some of the finest writers ever to pick up a pen or some such. A very powerful course. And of course, drama workshop, a hands-on drama course that you didn't have to be able to read all that well to participate in. And yet we did read and we did write and we did film. It was a special thing. Wasn't long before the 16 English elective courses were whittled down, always the regression back to the original, we need a course in composition. Everyone has to take it. That was the weird thing, actually. I probably should have mentioned it earlier. That was the weird thing about how education works. This journal idea that we made use of at Maslow, in which I began working in 1966, please note, I had never, ever been given a workbook journal anywhere in my education. I knew no colleague who had ever done it. But after the presentation in the humanistic conference, the word did begin to spread, and it began to spread very far, even before Maslow was going. And it wasn't long before the state suggested it, and then the state insisted on it, and then the state made it required for all 6 grades of high school. My God. Any event, that's how it kind of worked. So we were regressing back, and the 16 were whittled down, and pretty soon there were 4 electives remaining: photography, source studies, great books, psychology through literature, drama workshop. When we worked at Maslow, we extended the idea of the preparation of a lesson plan. And it stayed with me, and I think it's particularly relevant and important and needs to be addressed. Here the idea was not only to make sure that the number of different kinds of activities would occur so that the class would not lose interest over, I don't know, a 40, 50, 60 minute period, but also to make sure that those activities were of a different kind than that kind of intellectual stuff normally found in classes. We had to hit something which would motivate students, and there had to be a kind of hands-on approach to make it really fun. And one of the things that we did at Maslow was we would divide the page where the content ideas that we were addressing would be on one side and some sort of activity would be on the other side. And as I continued to work, I would go back and forth, and there would be many of these changes in the course of a single period. In a way, putting onto paper those aspects that Jung, say, would touch on when he talked about the whole person and how we needed to touch that. And we needed to touch it even in with a greater variance when we were dealing with a class of people who, after all, might learn in very different ways from each other. Some would have to see it. Some would have to touch it. It had to be hands-on or it meant nothing. And some would have to just think about it for a while and come back to it later. So even the follow-up work had to find additional ways of touching this subject. And so, by the time I got to college, for me, it was just time. I was a greater scholar, had done graduate work. It was time to go. It was no special thing. I stalled for the last 5 years. I was really ready to go before that. But the last 5 years I kind of stalled and finished my 20s so I could get some sort of a pension in the process. But I remember going into the office when we received the balloon check just before the summer, and I would say, 5, walk out. Nobody knew what the heck I was talking about. 4, 5. I walked out after 20 and I was done. And I was on to the next. One door closes, another door opens. The work continues. And I went out. I tried community colleges for a while. That was a dreadful idea. Had a temporary full-time employment to do SUNY. Awful. It was C-track, go to college. And here I was looking for greater intellectual stimulation. That was ridiculous. Anyway, so I finally, got a gig at Marist and later on at SUNY New Paltz, and lived a bit of the professor life as I had expected to all along, and the quality of the scholarship was allowed to increase, but the ideas remained largely the same. The courses changed names. Great Books of Western Civ was what we called it in one place. Classical literature was what we called it in another. But it was still source studies, just as I had only developed with greater literary references and the like. The last version of it was Mythic Modernism, Oz to Potter. I reincorporated the Greek and Roman myths and I did another special topics course, as I was always doing those, called Hell and Back. That was what I was most famous for at SUNY New Paltz. The student responses to Hell and Back were exquisite, as were the classes themselves. They would take the ideas, and on the college level, they would go back to their residential sleeping places, and they would discuss the ideas. They would run with the ideas. And in some sense, we had some of that at Maslow, but maybe not as intense as could happen in the college environment. But the same thing, again, I would present as the opening focus of a fundamental idea, and then you would switch somehow on the page, and there would be an opportunity for discussion, for doing something, for a fake quiz or test, for a follow-up of extraordinary specificity and dimension. Example, would open at some point with a discussion of ancient Mesopotamia. In the great books of Western Lit class, we go all the way back to the earliest of writing, even before Western God was established as the most fundamental value and thing to be honored. Back to the time of the goddess, and then the beginning sweep as Western civilizations gets louder and louder. And then I would say, okay, trace your family history. Using things like your last name, your family's name, your first name if it made reference to a religious text perhaps, and located it within a certain tradition. Ask your relatives. See who your oldest living relative might be. Get translations perhaps of their European or Turkish or who knows what language. Trace your family's history, and the punchline was, how close to Mesopotamia can you trace your family's roots? This, of course, involved the entire family. We could have been doing this right along. We could have done it in Brentwood. And we could certainly do it in college. With the aid of a computer, we could. And it brought it out of the dimension of some cerebral professor's idea. We go back to the earliest cities and how they were along rivers, and how that was an absolutely critical idea, not just in Western civ, but in civilization as we've come to know it. Go to Main Street was the follow-up. And without asking directions, find your way to the oldest community gardens in the state of New York. If you find it, ask persons what they think of it. I think you'll find them a reasonably friendly lot. Some of the planning included notions of surreptitious teaching practice. That is to say, one could announce the goal, or one could have a goal that was unannounced, and in that sense, surreptitious. It was something that I had deliberately included on the lesson plan sheet, the surreptitious lesson. And has rarely been addressed in the classroom, because something is gained, but also something is lost by being so directive that one always announces the goal. In fact, if I can back up just a minute, one of the aspects of human education is that other people can't do it for you. And when they try to so direct it because they have the goal in mind, in some sense, they undercut the very way in which human learning works, and the way in which one's own special soul gets involved in, and therefore solves the problem of motivation in, because your own curiosity is piqued, and you begin to go in unexpected directions. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is the way learning is designed. And our attempt in modern times to make the boxes smaller and smaller. There should be no special topics courses. We should standardize the curriculum. We should tell the students you must choose between 4 answers on tests after test. We should repeat the same tests endlessly. Is all bull. It's always been bull. And it's got to go away. And when the state said, when my chairman said, well, can we just can't do the special topics courses anymore now that you've turned everybody on to wanting to do their own special topics course. We can't do those anymore. I said, all right, I'll release my position. It's time that I do the next step. So one door closes, the next door opens. What's the next step for me? To share, as I have today, with the next generations of teachers who don't have to. Those of us who have taught and have come up with some very, very interesting things. You don't have to relearn them. You just have to hear them, mull them for a while, think about how you might want to apply it. And there are more than I could possibly do in a short time. But just to give you an idea, here's one. Students have diverse sticking points. You are an educator, and in many cases you look out on this realm of students with their particular sticking points. You see the body language that they present to you. You have a sense that some have not eaten in a while, even at 8 o'clock in the morning. You notice that some are barely able to see what you write on the board and get easily frustrated if they're asked to make sense of a piece of writing. And you know that something's wrong in terms of, maybe we could call it a name, we could call it dyslexia, we could call it they need new glasses, whatever we could call it. And you begin to be aware, and you have to find a way to work individually to help that student get past that point, or all of the hard work and preparation that is not going to get through because the processes are different. You have to know who's dreaming and sketching and approach them differently. You have to, well, how do I put this? You have to say to the parents, something's wrong here. Once upon a time, I was teaching 11th grade honors class in Brentwood Traditional High School. A student would whisper all the time. Couldn't get her to speak up. I was slow on the uptake. I didn't fully understand what was going on. And then parents' visiting day came. And her mother came in to see. The student kind of hid outside the class, but listened in to the conversation. I took a chance. I said, she's too old to hit. She was stunned. What did she say to you? She whispered, she's too old to hit. She threatened to go to the principal, of course, how dare I, and so forth and so on. Got through the year. 10 years went by. I get a call on Christmas Day. She was visiting her mom. She said, I just wanted you to know that day changed my life. Eventually, I went to Stanford, and I've just completed my doctorate. And that day changed my life.